Some people reach the age of 80 and still speak clearly, remember faces, and follow long conversations without effort. Others begin to feel mentally tired much earlier, sometimes before 60, even when their bodies still seem strong. This difference often feels unfair, even mysterious. It raises a quiet question many people carry with them, especially later in life. Why does the mind seem to age so differently from one person to another? For a long time, we were taught to think of aging as a simple decline, something that moves forward at the same speed for everyone. But the human brain does not work that way. It does not follow a single clock. It does not wear down evenly, year by year. Instead, it changes slowly, unevenly, shaped by decades of experience, rhythm, stress, and rest. Tonight, we will not rush to answers. Instead, we will take a longer view, one shaped by human history, biology, and the quiet patterns of everyday life. We will look at how the brain adapts, how it protects itself, and why staying mentally sharp is often less about speed and more about stability. As you listen, you do not need to judge yourself or compare your life to anyone else's. This is not a test, and it is not a warning. It is simply an invitation to understand how the human mind changes with time, and why, for some people, clarity remains long after the years have passed. Aging is often described as a single, steady process, as if the human body and the human mind were following the same internal clock, moving forward at the same pace for everyone. But when we look carefully at real human lives, this idea quietly breaks down. Two people can be born in the same year, grow up in similar environments, and yet experience mental aging in very different ways. One person may remain calm, focused, and mentally clear well into old age, while another begins to feel mentally tired much earlier, sometimes before 60. This difference is not rare or unusual. In fact, it is one of the most consistent patterns seen in human aging. The brain does not age evenly, and it never has. From a biological point of view, the human brain is not a single object that slowly wears out. It is a collection of many interconnected systems, each with its own rhythm, strength, and sensitivity. Some parts of the brain change very slowly over decades, while others respond more strongly to long-term pressure. Because of this, mental aging does not move in a straight line. It is uneven, gradual. For most of human history, this variation was not considered a problem. It was simply part of being human. In early human societies, older individuals often continued to play important roles even after physical strength declined. Their value did not depend on speed or quick reactions. It depended on memory, judgment, emotional balance, and the ability to recognize patterns built over many years. These qualities tend to age differently from raw mental speed. In many cases, they remain stable or even grow stronger later in life. This reminds us that mental aging is not only about loss, it is also about change and adaptation. Modern life has made these differences more visible and more uncomfortable. Today, people are constantly measured, compared, and evaluated. When the mind begins to slow, even slightly, it can feel like something is wrong. Yet biologically, slowing down is not the same as fading away. A slower brain can still be a steady and capable brain. The difficulty comes from expecting all minds to function in the same way, at the same pace, throughout the entire lifespan. Time itself also plays a quiet role. The brain is shaped not only by age, but by what accumulates over a lifetime. Long periods of stress, instability, and urgency leave subtle biological marks. So do long periods of routine, predictability, and rest. These patterns do not create sudden changes. Instead, they gently guide the brain toward either resilience or exhaustion over many years. Mental aging also does not happen all at once. Different abilities change at different times. Attention may weaken before memory, or memory may remain strong while mental energy feels lower. These differences are normal and reflect the complexity of the human brain. When we understand that mental aging is uneven by nature, we can begin to let go of the idea that everyone must age in the same way. The brain does not follow a single path, and clarity later in life is not an accident, but the result of long, quiet processes unfolding over time. When people think about mental aging, they often imagine a clear dividing line between a strong brain and a weak one, but in reality, the human brain rarely works in such simple categories. What many describe as mental decline is often a change in how the brain allocates its energy and attention. As the years pass, the brain gradually becomes less interested in speed and novelty, and more focused on efficiency and stability. This shift can feel uncomfortable in a world that values quick responses and constant stimulation, but biologically, it is not a sign of failure. A brain that slows down is not necessarily losing its ability to think. It is often conserving resources, choosing depth over speed, and prioritizing what truly matters. In earlier stages of life, mental sharpness is often defined by how quickly someone can process new information, switch tasks, or react to sudden changes. These abilities rely heavily on systems that are sensitive to stress, sleep disruption, and long-term pressure. At the same time, other systems, especially those linked to long-term memory, emotional regulation, and pattern recognition, tend to remain stable or decline much more slowly. This is why many older adults may feel slower in conversation yet wiser in judgment, calmer in decision-making, and more consistent in their thinking. The mistake comes when we interpret this shift as fading rather than rebalancing. Modern environments often amplify this misunderstanding. Daily life is filled with rapid information, constant alerts, and expectations of immediate response. When an aging brain does not respond in the same way it once did, the change can feel alarming. But biologically, the brain is doing what it has always done across human history. It is adjusting to long-term survival rather than short-term performance. For most of our past, speed was not the primary measure of mental strength in older individuals. Stability, memory, and emotional control were far more valuable. Another important aspect of this process is how the brain filters information with age. Younger brains tend to absorb large amounts of input, much of it unnecessary. Older brains often become more selective. They let go of irrelevant details and focus on familiar patterns. This selectivity can sometimes appear as forgetfulness, but it is often a form of efficiency. The brain is no longer trying to store everything. It is choosing what to keep. This change can protect mental clarity when life becomes simpler and more predictable. However, when life remains chaotic and demanding, this same selectivity can feel like exhaustion. This is why two people of the same age can experience mental aging so differently. One may live within a steady rhythm that supports the brain's natural shift, while the other continues to face constant pressure that drains mental reserves. In this way, staying sharp is not about resisting change. It is about allowing the brain to change in a way that supports balance rather than strain. Understanding this helps us see mental aging not as a sudden loss, but as a long, quiet transformation that begins earlier than we often realize and continues gently across the years. As the brain continues to change with age, one of the most important differences appears not in intelligence, but in how mental effort is experienced. Many people who feel they are fading are not losing their ability to think, but their tolerance for mental strain. Tasks that once felt effortless may now feel heavy, not because the brain is broken, but because it has become less willing to waste energy. Over decades, the brain learns which forms of effort are worth sustaining and which are not. This learning is slow and quiet, shaped by repetition, emotional patterns, and long-term habits rather than sudden events. In this sense, mental aging is not simply a biological countdown. It is a long negotiation between the brain and the life it has lived. When life has followed a relatively stable rhythm, with predictable routines and periods of rest, the brain often enters later life with a strong internal structure. It knows what to ignore, what to hold on to, and how to conserve its energy. This can look like clarity and calm. When life has been filled with constant urgency, unresolved stress, or long stretches of instability, the brain may reach later years already tired. In that state, even simple demands can feel overwhelming. This difference has little to do with intelligence and much to do with accumulated strain. Another key factor is how the brain relates to uncertainty. Younger brains are built to explore, adapt quickly. Older brains are built to stabilize. They rely more heavily on familiar patterns and known outcomes. This is not a weakness, it is a shift in purpose. In human history, elders were not expected to chase novelty. They were expected to preserve knowledge, maintain social balance, and provide continuity. When modern life continues to demand constant adaptation from an aging brain, tension arises. The brain is asked to perform in a way that no longer matches its natural direction. Over time, this mismatch can feel like fading, even when the brain itself remains capable. It is also important to recognize that mental clarity is not evenly distributed across all situations. Many people who feel foggy in fast-paced environments remain remarkably clear in quiet settings. Their thinking becomes sharper when pressure is removed. This tells us something essential. Mental sharpness in later life is highly context-dependent. It thrives in calm, familiar conditions and weakens under constant stimulation. This is why some people appear sharp at 80. Their lives have gradually aligned with the brain's changing needs. They have not forced their minds to compete with younger versions of themselves. Instead, they have allowed their thinking to settle into a slower, steadier form. In contrast, those who feel they fade earlier often carry forward expectations that no longer fit their biology. They push their minds to maintain speed rather than stability. Over time, this creates frustration and fatigue. By understanding this process, we begin to see that mental aging is not something that suddenly happens at a certain age. It is something that unfolds quietly across decades, shaped by rhythm, strain, and adaptation. Staying sharp is not about holding on to youth. It is about allowing the brain to age in a way that supports balance, clarity, and long-term resilience, rather than constant effort. When people talk about staying mentally sharp, they often imagine constant alertness, quick reactions, and the ability to handle many things at once. But these traits are not the same as long-term mental strength. In fact, the brain systems that support speed and constant switching are among the most fragile under prolonged pressure. They rely heavily on stable sleep, low stress, and regular recovery. Over time, especially across decades, these systems naturally lose priority. This does not mean the brain is becoming weaker. It means it is reorganizing itself around functions that are more sustainable. A brain that remains clear in later life is often not one that works faster, but one that works with less internal conflict. One of the most important distinctions to understand is the difference between effort and efficiency. Younger brains often rely on effort. They push through tasks by recruiting many systems at once, even when it is unnecessary. This can feel powerful in the short term, but it comes at a cost. As the years pass, the brain becomes less tolerant of this kind of waste. It begins to favor efficiency, choosing simpler paths and avoiding constant strain. This shift can be misinterpreted as decline, especially in environments that reward visible busyness. Yet biologically, it is a protective change. It reduces noise, lowers stress responses, and helps preserve clarity over longer periods. Another quiet change happens in how the brain handles emotional load. Emotional regulation tends to stabilize with age when life allows it. Older brains often react less intensely to minor disruptions and recover more slowly but more steadily from larger ones. This emotional steadiness supports mental clarity in subtle ways. When emotions are less volatile, cognitive resources are not constantly pulled in different directions. Thought becomes calmer, more linear, This is why many people feel clearer in later life when their emotional environment is stable, even if their thinking feels slower. Problems arise when emotional pressure remains high year after year. Chronic worry, unresolved tension, and constant urgency keep the brain in a state of alert that is difficult to maintain. Over time, this drains the systems responsible for focus and memory, making the mind feel tired rather than confused. In this context, fading is often a sign of exhaustion, not deterioration. The brain is still capable, but it no longer has the reserves to perform under continuous demand. This distinction matters because it changes how we interpret mental aging. A person who feels mentally foggy in demanding situations may still be clear, thoughtful, and articulate in quiet ones. It performs best when the environment matches its evolved strengths. Throughout human history, elders were not surrounded by constant stimulation. Their roles were embedded in slower rhythms, familiar tasks, and stable social patterns. Modern life often removes these supports while increasing demands. Understanding this helps explain why some people remain mentally clear well into old age. Their lives gradually align with the brain's natural shift toward efficiency and emotional balance. Others struggle earlier because their lives continue to demand constant effort. Mental sharpness, then, is not about resisting age. It is about allowing the brain to reorganize in ways that protect clarity rather than drain it. One of the most overlooked reasons some people remain mentally sharp longer than others lies in how their brains learn to rest while still awake. Rest is often understood as sleep, but the brain also requires periods of low demand during the day. Over time, brains that experience regular mental rest become more resilient. They recover more easily from effort and maintain clarity for longer stretches. Brains that are rarely allowed to rest, even when awake, gradually lose this flexibility. This difference accumulates quietly across decades. It is not dramatic, and it is rarely noticed until later in life, when the cost becomes visible. Many people who feel they are fading did not suddenly lose their mental ability. Instead, they spent years keeping their minds constantly engaged, alert, and occupied, often without interruption. The brain can tolerate this for a long time, but not forever. As age increases, the cost of constant engagement rises. The same level of stimulation that once felt normal begins to feel draining. This is not a failure of the brain. It is a signal that the brain's balance between effort and recovery has been stretched too far. Another important factor is how the brain handles familiarity. With age, the brain increasingly relies on familiar patterns to conserve energy. Familiarity allows the brain to operate smoothly, without recruiting excessive resources. When life includes stable routines, repeated environments, and predictable rhythms, the brain can perform with remarkable clarity even in later years. In contrast, when life remains fragmented and unpredictable, the brain must constantly reorient itself. This constant reorientation is expensive. Over time, it reduces the brain's reserve. Mental sharpness in older age often reflects how well a person's life has gradually narrowed its demands, not in a limiting way, but in a stabilizing one. This narrowing allows the brain to focus its energy where it is most effective. Emotional familiarity plays a similar role. Long-term relationships, familiar social roles, and stable emotional environments reduce the cognitive load required to navigate daily life. When the brain does not need to decode new emotional situations constantly, it frees resources for memory, reflection, and sustained thought. This is why some people appear clearer as they age. Their emotional worlds have become simpler and more predictable, not empty, but settled. Others continue to live in emotionally demanding contexts that require constant adjustment. In those cases, mental fatigue can appear much earlier. Importantly, none of this happens suddenly. The brain does not decide at 60 or 70 to change its strategy. These patterns are laid down gradually, beginning much earlier in adulthood. Each year of overstimulation Each year without sufficient mental rest adds a small layer of strain. Each year of rhythm, repetition, and emotional stability adds a layer of protection. By the time people notice differences in mental clarity, these layers are already thick. This perspective helps us understand why advice focused on short-term improvement often misses the point. Mental sharpness in later life is not something that can be quickly restored once it feels lost. It is the outcome of long-term alignment between the brain and the structure of daily life. People who remain sharp longer are not necessarily more disciplined or more intelligent. Their lives have simply allowed their brains to age in a way that supports recovery rather than constant output. When we see mental aging through this lens, fading becomes less mysterious. It is not a sudden decline, but the visible result of many quiet years in which the brain was asked to give more than it could sustainably provide. Another quiet shift that separates long-lasting mental clarity from early fading is how the brain relates to identity over time. In younger years, many people define themselves through performance, productivity, and constant mental engagement. Thinking quickly, reacting fast, and staying mentally busy become part of who they believe they are. This identity can be motivating early in life, but it creates a hidden tension as the brain ages. When mental speed naturally slows, the person may experience not just cognitive change, but a sense of personal loss. The brain is then asked to defend an old identity rather than adapt to a new internal rhythm. This internal conflict consumes energy. Over many years, it quietly drains mental reserves. In contrast, people who remain sharp longer often undergo a gradual shift in how they define themselves. Their sense of identity becomes less tied to speed and output, and more connected to consistency, understanding, and presence. This change reduces pressure on the brain. It allows thinking to settle rather than struggle. The brain is no longer forced to prove itself through constant performance. Instead, it is allowed to function in a way that feels natural for its stage of life. Another important factor is how the brain responds to silence and mental space. For many people, silence feels uncomfortable. They fill it with information, noise, or tasks. Over time, the brain becomes accustomed to constant input. When that input is removed, the mind feels restless or dull. This pattern can make aging feel like fading, because the brain has not practiced being clear without stimulation. In contrast, brains that have long been familiar with quiet moments tend to remain clear in later life. Silence does not feel empty to them. It feels stable. This familiarity with mental space allows thoughts to form slowly and coherently, without urgency. It supports clarity rather than confusion. The way a person relates to mistakes also plays a role. Younger brains often recover quickly from errors, while older brains recover more slowly but more carefully. When life allows this slower recovery, clarity remains intact. When life demands immediate correction and constant self-monitoring, the brain stays tense. Over time, this tension accumulates. Mental sharpness suffers not because of loss of ability, but because the brain is never allowed to fully settle. This helps explain why some people appear mentally sharp at 80. Their lives no longer require constant self-correction. They move within familiar patterns where mistakes are not threatening. Their brains operate with confidence rather than vigilance. The brain stays on guard, using energy that could otherwise support clarity. It is also worth noting that mental sharpness is closely tied to how the brain experiences time. When life feels rushed, the brain perceives constant shortage. When life feels spacious, the brain relaxes. Over decades, this difference shapes mental aging. People who live with a sense of time pressure often carry that pressure into older age. Their brains remain alert but strained. Those who gradually slow their pace give their brains permission to shift into a mode that favors stability. This does not happen through deliberate effort. It happens through repeated alignment between life structure and the brain's changing needs. By the time these individuals reach later life, Clarity feels natural rather than forced. In this way, mental aging reflects not just biology, but a long relationship between the brain and the expectations placed upon it. Staying sharp is less about holding on to earlier capacities and more about releasing the need to be who one was before. When the brain is allowed to redefine its role, it often finds a calmer, clearer way to continue. One of the strongest foundations for long-term mental clarity lies in how memory is organized across a lifetime, especially the balance between short-term demands and long-term continuity. While novelty has its place, the human brain was not designed to rely on continuous new input for stability. Instead, it evolved to build deep, layered memory structures over long periods of time. These structures act like internal maps, allowing the brain to navigate the present without constant effort. People who remain mentally clear later in life often rely more on these deep maps than on rapid processing. Their thinking feels grounded because it rests on accumulated understanding, rather than constant updating. Long-term memory does more than store facts. It provides context, meaning, and emotional grounding. When the brain can place new experiences into familiar frameworks, it reduces strain. This process becomes increasingly important with age. As the brain naturally shifts away from speed, long-term memory offers an efficient alternative. It allows thinking to remain coherent even when reaction time slows. In contrast, when a person's mental life has been dominated by short-term pressure and constant novelty, these deep frameworks may be weaker. The brain then has fewer stable reference points to rely on. Each new situation feels heavier because it must be processed almost from scratch. Over decades, this difference quietly shapes mental aging. Another key element is the role of narrative memory. Humans do not simply remember events. They remember stories about their lives. When a person has a coherent sense of their past, the brain spends less energy trying to interpret the present. Experiences feel connected rather than fragmented. This coherence supports mental clarity in subtle ways. People who remain sharp often have a strong sense of continuity in their lives. Their memories form a long connected thread rather than a collection of isolated moments. This does not require a dramatic or successful life. It requires repetition, familiarity, and the ability to revisit the same memories without distress. Emotional tone matters as well. Memories that are emotionally settled place less demand on the brain. When past experiences have been integrated rather than constantly reprocessed, the mind becomes quieter. This quietness supports focus and reflection. In contrast, unresolved memories continue to pull attention backward. They create background noise that competes with present thought. Over time, this noise can make the mind feel tired and scattered. The difference between these two states often becomes visible later in life, when the brain has fewer reserves to manage internal conflict. It is also important to understand that long-term memory is strengthened by rhythm. Repeated routines, familiar places, and stable relationships reinforce memory networks without conscious effort. These networks become reliable anchors as other systems slow down. This is why people who live within consistent rhythms often appear mentally steady in older age. Their brains are supported by structures built quietly over many years. Those whose lives have been highly fragmented may reach later life without these anchors. Their brains must work harder to maintain clarity. This effort can feel like fading, even when intelligence remains intact. Mental sharpness, from this perspective, is closely tied to how the past has been woven into the present. When memory serves as a stable foundation rather than a source of strain, the brain ages with greater ease. Understanding this helps shift attention away from chasing constant stimulation and toward appreciating the quiet strength of long-term continuity. As life progresses, the way memory is used becomes just as important as how much is retained. Many people fear forgetting specific details, names, or dates, but long-term mental clarity depends less on precise recall and more on meaningful retrieval. The aging brain gradually shifts away from storing isolated pieces of information and toward preserving patterns, relationships, and emotional significance. This shift is not accidental. It reflects the brain's effort to maintain coherence while reducing unnecessary load. People who remain mentally clear later in life often rely on memory as a guiding framework rather than a storage system. They remember the essence of experiences rather than every detail. This allows thinking to remain fluid even when recall becomes less exact. In contrast, people who place high value on precise memory may experience greater frustration as age changes recall speed. The brain is then forced to fight its own adaptation. Another important element is how memory is rehearsed over time. Memories that are revisited gently, through reflection or familiar conversation, tend to become more stable and less demanding. They settle into the background of the mind, available when needed, but not intrusive. This process strengthens memory networks without requiring effort. When memory rehearsal is stressful, however, the opposite happens. The brain associates recall with pressure. Over time, this can make memory feel unreliable, even when it is still intact. The difference between these two patterns often becomes noticeable later in life. People who revisit their past calmly tend to experience memory as supportive. People who revisit it with urgency or regret often experience it as draining. Emotional integration plays a central role here. Memories that have found emotional resolution require less ongoing attention. They do not demand reinterpretation or defense. This frees mental resources for present thought. When emotional resolution is absent, memory remains active in the background. The brain must constantly manage unresolved meaning. Over decades, this background activity contributes to mental fatigue. It does not erase memory, but it makes thinking feel crowded. This is one reason why some individuals feel mentally tired even when they remember well. Their memories are still working, but they are working too hard. Stability in memory use is also influenced by environment. Familiar settings reinforce memory without conscious effort. When the same places, routines, and relationships repeat over time, memory networks remain active and efficient. The brain does not need to reconstruct context repeatedly. This efficiency supports clarity in later life. In contrast, frequent changes in environment force the brain to constantly rebuild context. While this can be stimulating earlier in life, it becomes costly over time. The brain must devote more energy to orientation rather than reflection. This cost accumulates quietly. By the time aging becomes noticeable, the difference in mental ease can be striking. Importantly, none of these processes require exceptional intelligence. They depend on alignment between memory use and the brain's changing priorities. People who remain sharp do not necessarily remember more. They remember differently. Their memories support present thought rather than compete with it. They allow memory to become a stable background rather than an active burden. This perspective helps explain why mental clarity often feels tied to life coherence rather than mental training. When memory is allowed to simplify, to hold meaning instead of detail, the mind remains clear not because it resists change, but because it works with the form memory naturally takes over time. As memory continues to evolve with age, one final distinction becomes clear between minds that remain steady: the relationship between memory and expectation. Many people carry an unspoken belief that memory should function the same way throughout life. When it changes, they interpret this as loss. The brain, however, does not share this expectation. It adjusts its memory strategy to match long-term survival rather than short-term accuracy. When expectations remain rigid, the brain experiences constant friction. Each moment of hesitation or partial recall becomes a source of tension. Over time, this tension accumulates, making memory feel unreliable even when it is functioning within a normal, adaptive range. People who remain mentally clear later in life often adjust their expectations without consciously realizing it. They stop demanding precision from memory and instead trust its ability to guide them through familiar situations. This trust reduces internal pressure. The brain no longer has to defend itself against constant self-evaluation. Thinking becomes calmer, less interrupted by doubt. In contrast, those who expect memory to perform as it once did often remain in a state of quiet vigilance. They monitor their own thinking, watching for mistakes. This self-monitoring consumes cognitive resources. It turns memory into a performance rather than a support system. Over years, this shift can make the mind feel tense and brittle. Another important factor is how memory interacts with social context. Conversations in later life often rely less on rapid exchange of information and more on shared understanding. When social environments allow pauses, repetition, and reflection, memory operates smoothly. Meaning flows even when details are imprecise. When social environments demand quick recall and constant updating, memory feels strained. People who remain sharp tend to live within social rhythms that accommodate the brain's changing tempo. Their conversations unfold slowly, their relationships are familiar. This reduces the cognitive load required to participate. The brain does not need to rush. It can retrieve what matters when it matters. This ease supports clarity. It is also worth noting that memory benefits from acceptance of forgetting. When forgetting is accepted, the brain can focus on what remains relevant. When forgetting is resisted, the brain must constantly check itself, increasing strain. Over time, acceptance allows memory to settle into a stable pattern. Resistance keeps it unsettled. This difference often becomes visible later in life. Those who accept change experience memory as quieter and more reliable. Those who resist experience it as fragile and unpredictable. Finally, memory stability depends on how the brain is allowed to slow down. Slower recall does not mean weaker memory. It often means deeper retrieval. When time is allowed, memory arrives with context and meaning. When time is pressured, memory fragments. People who remain mentally clear later in life often live within a pace that allows memory to surface naturally. They do not rush their thinking. This patience protects clarity. By understanding memory as a dynamic system rather than a static ability, we can see why some people stay sharp while others feel they fade. The difference is not simply how much they remember, but how gently they allow memory to work. When memory is trusted, accepted, and aligned with realistic expectations, the brain carries it forward with stability. When memory is treated as something that must constantly prove itself, it becomes a source of strain. Mental sharpness, in this sense, reflects a long relationship between memory and self-expectation, shaped quietly across decades. One of the most influential forces shaping mental clarity across a lifetime is long-term stress. Not the sudden kind that appears briefly and fades, but the slow, persistent pressure that becomes part of daily life. The human brain is capable of handling short bursts of stress remarkably well. However, it was not designed to remain in a state of constant alert for decades. When stress becomes chronic, it quietly alters how the brain allocates energy. Systems involved in vigilance, worry, and anticipation begin to dominate, while systems responsible for reflection, memory integration, and calm reasoning receive fewer resources. This shift happens gradually, often unnoticed, until mental fatigue becomes a familiar background state. People who appear to fade earlier are often those whose brains have spent many years managing ongoing pressure rather than recovering from it. Chronic stress does not always feel dramatic. It can take the form of long-term responsibility, unresolved tension, or a persistent sense of urgency. Over time, the brain adapts by staying partially activated, even during rest. This reduces its ability to fully recover. Sleep becomes lighter, attention becomes scattered, and mental effort feels heavier than it once did. None of this indicates a loss of intelligence. It reflects a brain that has learned to expect strain. In contrast, people who remain mentally clear later in life often experience stress in cycles rather than as a constant. Their lives allowed periods of release, predictability, and emotional safety. These intervals gave the brain permission to return to a baseline state, preserving its flexibility. Another important aspect is how stress interacts with time perception. Chronic stress compresses time. The brain becomes focused on what is immediately next, leaving little space for reflection. Over years, this forward pressure weakens the brain's connection to long-term perspective. Memory becomes more task-oriented, less narrative. This makes thinking feel fragmented. When the brain is rarely allowed to drift, recall becomes mechanical rather than meaningful. Mental clarity suffers not because memory is gone, but because it lacks context. In calmer conditions, the brain naturally reconnects memory to broader patterns. This restores coherence. Emotional stress also shapes mental aging through repetition. Repeated emotional strain teaches the brain to remain guarded. This guarded state consumes energy. It keeps emotional and cognitive systems from fully relaxing. Over decades, this persistent guarding reduces the brain's tolerance for additional demand. Mental sharpness then appears fragile. People may still think clearly, but only when conditions are just right. Any additional pressure quickly overwhelms their reserves. This is often mistaken for decline. In reality, it is the result of long-term emotional overuse. The opposite pattern is seen in those who stay sharp. Their emotional environments gradually become simpler. Conflicts resolve or fade. Expectations soften. The brain no longer needs to defend itself constantly. This allows cognitive systems to operate with less interference. Thought becomes clearer because it is not competing with background tension. Importantly, this does not mean a life without difficulty. It means a life where difficulty does not remain unresolved indefinitely. The brain benefits from closure, even partial. It also benefits from predictability. When daily life follows a steady rhythm, stress responses are not constantly triggered. This protects mental clarity. Over time, the difference between chronic stress and cyclical stress becomes visible in how people age mentally. Those whose brains were allowed to recover repeatedly tend to remain clearer. Those whose brains were kept in prolonged alertness tend to feel mentally tired earlier. Understanding this helps shift the focus away from age alone and toward the quiet role of accumulated pressure in shaping the aging mind. Chronic stress not only drains energy, it slowly reshapes how the brain learns to anticipate the world. When stress remains present for long periods, the brain begins to expect difficulty even in neutral situations. This expectation subtly alters attention. The mind becomes biased toward potential problems, scanning for what might go wrong rather than settling into what is stable. Over time, this habit of anticipation fragments thought. Mental clarity suffers not because thinking ability disappears, but because attention is constantly pulled away before it can fully settle. People who experience this often describe their minds as restless or foggy. Even when they are not actively worried, the brain has simply learned to stay alert by default. Stress strengthens the encoding of emotionally charged experiences while weakening the integration of those experiences into a broader narrative. Memories remain vivid but disconnected. Instead of forming a coherent story of the past, the brain stores isolated moments of tension. These moments can resurface unpredictably, consuming attention. Over years, this pattern increases mental noise. Thought becomes interrupted, and reflection becomes harder to sustain. In contrast, when stress is resolved or allowed to pass, emotional memory tends to integrate more fully. Experiences become part of a larger context. They lose their urgency. This integration reduces cognitive load. The mind becomes quieter, allowing clarity to return. Stress also affects how the brain relates to effort. Under prolonged pressure, effort becomes associated with discomfort. The brain learns that sustained focus leads to strain. As a result, it may resist concentration later in life. Tasks that require attention feel heavier than they should. This resistance is often mistaken for decline. In reality, it is a protective response. The brain is trying to avoid states it has learned to associate with overload. People who remain mentally sharp later in life often have a different relationship with effort. Their brains learned that effort could be followed by recovery. Focus was not endlessly demanded. Because of this, attention remains accessible rather than guarded. The difference between these two patterns often becomes visible as people age. One mind approaches effort cautiously, conserving energy. The other approaches it with confidence, knowing it will not be punished. Another subtle factor is how stress shapes internal dialogue. Chronic stress encourages constant self-monitoring. The brain checks its own performance repeatedly, watching for errors. This internal surveillance consumes resources. Thinking becomes layered with evaluation. Over time, this reduces fluency. Ideas feel harder to hold because they are being judged as they form. In calmer conditions, self-monitoring decreases. Thoughts are allowed to unfold without immediate correction. This supports clarity. Many people who remain sharp later in life describe feeling less concerned with how their thinking appears. This is not indifference. It is freedom from constant internal pressure. Importantly, the brain does not need a stress-free life to age well. It needs stress that moves, resolves, and releases. When stress becomes static, clarity erodes. When stress is cyclical, clarity survives. This distinction helps explain why two people with similar histories can age mentally so differently. Over decades, the brain records these patterns. By the time aging becomes noticeable, the effects are already present. Mental sharpness then reflects not resilience alone, but the cumulative rhythm of strain and recovery that shape the brain across a lifetime. Over time, the most lasting impact of chronic stress is not how much it exhausts the brain in any single moment, but how it teaches the brain to relate to the future. A brain shaped by long-term pressure often learns to live slightly ahead of itself, anticipating demands before they arrive. This forward-leaning state keeps cognitive systems partially engaged even during rest. The mind rarely feels fully settled. Thought may remain sharp in short bursts, but sustained clarity becomes difficult. This pattern often leads people to believe they are fading, when in reality their brains have simply lost the ability to disengage. The brain is still capable, but it is rarely allowed to be at ease. In contrast, people who remain mentally clear later in life often have brains that learn to return to the present. Their stress responses activate when needed and then release. This ability to disengage is critical. It allows mental systems to reset, preserving long-term clarity. Chronic stress trains the brain to treat uncertainty as threat. Ambiguity becomes uncomfortable. The mind seeks constant resolution, constantly scanning for answers. This creates mental tension. When answers are not immediately available, thought becomes fragmented. Over decades, this habit reduces tolerance for open-ended thinking. Reflection becomes tiring. People may feel mentally overwhelmed not because problems are complex, but because uncertainty itself has become exhausting. Those who remain sharp tend to have a different relationship with uncertainty. Their brains have learned that not all questions require immediate resolution. This acceptance reduces cognitive strain. Thought can remain open, flexible, and calm. Stress also affects how the brain experiences rest. In a stressed brain, rest often feels unproductive or even unsafe. Silence may trigger unease. The mind fills quiet moments with worry or planning. This prevents true recovery. Over time, the brain loses access to deep rest outside of sleep. Even then, sleep may remain light. Mental clarity suffers because recovery is incomplete. In brains that age well, rest is familiar. Quiet does not provoke alarm. The mind can slow without fear. This ability to rest while awake protects cognitive systems across decades. It allows memory, attention, and emotional regulation to replenish. This replenishment is subtle but powerful. It accumulates quietly, becoming visible only later in life. Another lasting effect of stress is its influence on self-compassion. Chronic pressure often narrows tolerance for imperfection. The brain becomes critical of itself. Mistakes feel costly. This internal harshness consumes mental resources. Thinking becomes guarded, creativity and reflection weaken. In later life, this can feel like mental fragility. In contrast, brains that experienced relief and resolution often develop greater self-acceptance. Errors are less threatening, thought flows more easily. This softness supports clarity. Importantly, none of these differences are determined by age alone. They reflect how the brain learned to live with pressure over many years. Mental sharpness later in life is often the visible result of invisible habits formed long before. It reflects whether the brain learned to release tension, accept uncertainty, and rest without fear. When stress shaped the brain to remain vigilant, clarity becomes harder to sustain. When stress was allowed to pass, clarity remains accessible. Understanding this helps reframe mental aging. It shifts attention away from inevitable decline and toward the long-term patterns that quietly shape how the mind experiences time, effort, and rest. Another key reason some people remain mentally sharp while others feel they fade lies in the brain's ability to reorganize itself over time. The human brain is not a fixed structure. Throughout life, it continuously adjusts how tasks are distributed across networks. When conditions allow, this reorganization becomes a quiet form of protection. As certain systems slow or become less efficient, others subtly compensate. This process does not restore youth, but it preserves function. People who remain clear later in life often rely on these compensatory patterns without being aware of them. Their thinking may feel different from earlier years, but it remains coherent because the brain has learned new pathways rather than insisting on old ones. This ability to reorganize depends heavily on flexibility. Flexibility is not about learning faster. It is about letting go of rigid habits of thinking. Brains that insist on doing everything the same way they always have place unnecessary strain on aging systems. When a familiar method becomes harder, frustration arises. The brain then expends energy trying to force an outdated strategy to work. Over time, this effort contributes to fatigue and a sense of decline. In contrast, brains that remain flexible allow tasks to be handled differently. When speed decreases, they rely more on sequencing. When memory retrieval slows, they rely more on cues and context. These adjustments happen quietly, often without conscious planning. The result is a form of clarity that feels steady rather than sharp-edged. Another important aspect of adaptation is how the brain reduces unnecessary complexity. Younger minds often manage multiple streams of information simultaneously. While impressive, this approach is inefficient over the long term. As the brain ages, it naturally narrows its focus. It drops tasks that no longer serve a clear purpose. This narrowing is sometimes misinterpreted as loss of capacity. In reality, it is a refinement. By concentrating on fewer demands, the brain preserves energy for what remains. People who accept this narrowing tend to feel more stable. People who resist it often feel overwhelmed. The difference becomes more pronounced with age. Environmental support also plays a role in how well the brain adapts. When daily life offers clear structure, predictable routines, and familiar tools, the brain can reorganize with ease. It does not need to solve the same problems repeatedly. This frees resources for reflection and understanding. In chaotic environments, adaptation becomes harder. The brain is forced to constantly reorient, leaving little room for compensation. Over time, this limits the effectiveness of reorganization. Mental sharpness then feels fragile. It is not that the brain cannot adapt, but that it is never given the conditions to do so. Emotional attitude toward change matters as well. Adaptation requires acceptance. When changes in thinking are viewed as failure, the brain remains tense. When they are viewed as natural shifts, the brain relaxes. This relaxation supports reorganization. People who remain clear later in life often describe a gradual softening of expectations. They stop demanding the same output from themselves. This reduces internal resistance. The brain can then explore alternative ways of functioning. These alternatives may be slower, but they are often more reliable. Over time, reliability matters more than speed. It supports confidence and reduces cognitive strain. Importantly, adaptation does not mean constant improvement. It means stability through adjustment. The brain is not trying to become better. It is trying to remain workable. When allowed to do this, it often succeeds remarkably well. Many individuals who appear sharp at 80 are not operating at the limits of their capacity. They are operating within a carefully adjusted range that suits their current biology. This range feels natural because it was reached gradually. Those who fade earlier often fight this adjustment. They measure themselves against past abilities and feel the gap as loss. In doing so, they prevent the brain from settling into its adaptive mode. Understanding mental aging through adaptation rather than decline helps explain why clarity can persist even as abilities change. The brain does not need to remain the same to remain clear. It needs the freedom to reorganize in ways that reduce strain and support continuity. Adaptation in the aging brain also depends on how attention is guided and protected over time. Attention is not an unlimited resource. It must be directed carefully if clarity is to remain. In earlier life, attention is often spread widely, pulled toward many competing demands. The brain can tolerate this for years, but over time the cost becomes visible. As the brain ages, it naturally seeks to simplify where attention goes. It becomes less willing to divide itself endlessly. People who remain mentally clear later in life often allow this narrowing to happen. They stop forcing themselves to attend to everything. Instead, they give attention to fewer things, but with greater consistency. This focused use of attention supports adaptation by reducing internal competition. When attention is not constantly fragmented, the brain can reorganize more effectively. In contrast, people who try to maintain the same level of attentional spread often feel mentally strained. Their brains are asked to do too much with fewer reserves. Over time, this strain feels like fading. Another important factor is how the brain adapts through external supports. Adaptation does not happen only inside the brain. It also happens through changes in how life is structured. Notes, routines, familiar sequences, and physical cues all become part of the brain's extended system. People who remain clear often accept and use these supports naturally. They do not see them as signs of weakness. They see them as practical tools. This acceptance allows the brain to conserve energy for higher-level thinking. When external supports are resisted out of pride or fear, the brain must compensate internally. This compensation is costly. Over years, it contributes to fatigue and reduced clarity. Emotional flexibility plays a role here as well. Adaptation requires tolerance for change without excessive self-criticism. When thinking patterns shift, the brain needs space to experiment. If every change is judged harshly, adaptation stalls. The brain remains locked in familiar but inefficient modes. People who age well mentally often show a gentler attitude toward themselves. They allow pauses, repetitions, and adjustments. This gentleness reduces stress and supports reorganization. Another subtle form of adaptation involves prioritizing depth over breadth. As the brain ages, it becomes more efficient when it can dwell on topics it knows well. Depth allows the brain to operate within established networks. Breadth requires constant creation of new connections. People who remain sharp often gravitate toward interests that allow depth, whether in conversation, reading, or daily activities. These interests reinforce existing pathways rather than stretching the brain thin. This does not limit growth. It supports sustainability. Those who insist on constant novelty may feel mentally stimulated for a time, but the long-term cost can be high. The brain spends energy building connections it cannot maintain. Over decades, this contributes to exhaustion rather than clarity. Adaptation also involves letting go of unnecessary speed. Speed is often mistaken for sharpness. In reality, speed becomes less reliable with age. People who remain clear accept this. They allow themselves more time to think and respond. This extra time allows adaptive pathways to function fully. When speed is demanded, the brain may bypass these pathways, leading to errors or confusion. Slowing down is not surrender. It is a strategic adjustment. It allows the brain to use what it has most efficiently. Finally, adaptation is reinforced by consistency. The brain adapts best when changes are gradual and repeated. Sudden, forced adjustments create stress. Gentle, repeated shifts create stability. People who remain sharp often reach later life having already adapted many times in small ways. Each adaptation made the next one easier. By the time aging becomes noticeable, their brains are skilled at adjustment. Those who fade earlier often encounter adaptation only when pressure is already high. The brain is then asked to change while under strain. This is far more difficult. Mental clarity, in this sense, reflects a history of gradual alignment rather than sudden correction. When adaptation is allowed to unfold slowly across decades, the brain remains workable, flexible, and clear even as it changes. One final aspect of adaptation that strongly influences mental clarity over time is how the brain learns to cooperate with its own limits rather than fight against them. Every brain, at every age, operates within boundaries. In younger years, these boundaries feel distant. Energy recovers quickly, mistakes are easily corrected, and effort often produces immediate results. As the brain ages, these margins narrow, recovery takes longer. Effort must be used more carefully. People who remain mentally clear later in life are often those whose brains learned, gradually, to respect these changing limits. This respect does not feel like restriction, it feels like wisdom. The brain stops pushing itself into states that produce diminishing returns and instead chooses conditions where it can function smoothly. In contrast, when limits are ignored or denied, the brain remains locked in a cycle of overexertion and frustration. Over time, this cycle erodes confidence and clarity. Another important element is how the brain learns to sequence effort. Adaptation is not about avoiding effort entirely. It is about spacing it. Brains that age well tend to alternate naturally between focus and release. They do not expect sustained concentration without interruption. This rhythm allows neural systems to recover before strain accumulates. When effort is stacked without release, even capable brains begin to feel fragile. Many people who fade earlier are not lacking ability. They are lacking spacing. Their brains are repeatedly asked to perform at the edge of their capacity without adequate recovery. Over decades, this pattern leaves little room for adaptation. Mental sharpness then becomes situational rather than stable. Acceptance also plays a critical role in this final stage of adaptation. When the brain is allowed to acknowledge what is harder and what remains strong, it can reorganize intelligently. It allocates resources where they are most effective. When acceptance is absent, the brain wastes energy, compensating for imagined losses or defending against perceived weakness. This defensive stance keeps cognitive systems tense. Clarity suffers because thought is always braced. People who remain sharp often describe a subtle shift toward realism. They stop comparing their current thinking to earlier versions of themselves. They measure clarity by usefulness rather than speed. This change frees the brain from constant self-evaluation. Another quiet contributor to adaptation is patience. Patience allows processes to unfold at the brain's current pace. It reduces the pressure to produce immediate results. This matters because many adaptive pathways require time. When the brain is rushed, it defaults to older, less efficient strategies. When time is allowed, new patterns can stabilize. People who remain clear often live within a pace that supports patience. Their environments do not demand constant urgency. This allows adaptation to complete rather than remain partial. Over time, partial adaptation feels like confusion. Complete adaptation feels like calm. Finally, adaptation is reinforced by trust. Trust in the brain's ability to find balance. When trust is present, the brain explores alternative routes without fear. When trust is absent, the brain clings to familiar strategies, even when they no longer work well. This clinging increases strain. Trust allows letting go. Letting go allows reorganization. Over decades, this sequence shapes mental aging. Those who remain sharp are not resisting change. They are cooperating with it. Their brains are not trying to return to earlier states. They are settling into configurations that match current needs. This cooperation produces a form of clarity that is quieter but often more reliable. It does not announce itself through speed or intensity. It shows itself through steadiness, confidence, and ease. In this way, adaptation reaches its final form not as improvement, but as harmony between capacity, expectation, and pace. When that harmony is achieved, mental sharpness can persist even as the brain continues to change. One of the least obvious yet most powerful influences on mental clarity in later life is the rhythm of daily living. The brain is deeply sensitive to rhythm, not only in sleep and wake cycles, but in how days unfold over years. When life follows a relatively steady pattern, the brain can predict what comes next. This predictability reduces cognitive load. Fewer resources are spent preparing for surprise, and more can be devoted to reflection, memory, and calm attention. Over time, this rhythm becomes a form of support. People who remain mentally clear often live within days that resemble one another in structure, even if the content varies. This repetition does not dull the mind. It stabilizes it. In contrast, when daily life remains irregular and fragmented, the brain is repeatedly forced into a state of readiness. Each day demands orientation. Each change requires adjustment. While this can feel stimulating earlier in life, it becomes draining over decades. Mental clarity then feels fragile, dependent on how calm or chaotic the day happens to be. Another important aspect of rhythm is timing. The brain ages better when activities occur at roughly consistent times. Eating, resting, socializing, and thinking all benefit from regular placement within the day. This regularity allows internal systems to synchronize. Attention becomes steadier because it is not constantly reset. Memory benefits because events are anchored within familiar temporal frames. When timing is inconsistent, the brain must repeatedly recalibrate. This recalibration is subtle but costly. Over years, it contributes to mental fatigue. People who stay sharp often do not realize how much their routines protect them. They simply feel more settled. Social rhythm also plays a role. Regular contact with familiar people, even brief, reinforces emotional stability. The brain does not need to decode new social signals constantly. Conversations follow known patterns. This reduces strain on attention and emotional processing. In later life, this familiarity becomes especially valuable. It allows social interaction to support clarity rather than consume it. In contrast, frequent exposure to unfamiliar or demanding social contexts keeps the brain alert. Over time, this alertness erodes ease. Mental sharpness becomes harder to sustain. The rhythm of thought itself changes with age. Older brains often think more deeply when allowed to move slowly. When life respects this slower rhythm, clarity emerges naturally. When life demands quick shifts and constant interruption, thinking becomes shallow and scattered. People who remain clear often protect their thinking time without consciously planning to do so. Their days include stretches of quiet, predictable activity. These stretches allow thoughts to unfold fully. This is not inactivity. It is cognitive pacing. Another subtle element is the rhythm of expectation. When expectations are stable and realistic, the brain relaxes. It knows what is required and what is not. When expectations shift constantly, the brain remains on guard. Over decades, this vigilance undermines clarity. Those who age well mentally often simplify expectations as life progresses. They narrow what truly matters. This narrowing aligns well with the brain's changing priorities. It reduces unnecessary effort. Importantly, rhythm does not mean rigidity. Occasional change is not harmful. What matters is the underlying pattern. A life with a steady base can absorb variation. A life without rhythm cannot. Mental clarity in later life often reflects whether the brain had a reliable structure to return to. When rhythm is present, the brain rests between demands. When rhythm is absent, the brain never fully recovers. This difference accumulates quietly. By the time aging becomes noticeable, the effects are already built in. Understanding the role of rhythm helps explain why some people appear calm and clear at 80. Their lives move at a pace their brains can trust. Those who fade earlier often live within patterns their brains must constantly question. Mental sharpness, then, is supported not only by biology, but by the gentle order of everyday life repeated over many years. Daily rhythm does more than organize time. It quietly shapes how the brain experiences safety. When the brain can anticipate the flow of the day, it relaxes its constant monitoring. This relaxation is not laziness. It is a biological signal that resources can be shifted away from vigilance and toward maintenance. Over years, this shift protects mental clarity. People who remain sharp often live within rhythms that feel safe to the brain. Their days do not constantly surprise them. Even when challenges arise, they occur within a familiar structure. This allows the brain to respond without remaining on edge afterward. In contrast, when daily life lacks rhythm, the brain rarely feels safe enough to fully disengage. Attention stays partially activated, scanning for what might come next. Over decades, this state becomes exhausting. Mental sharpness then depends heavily on circumstance. On calm days, clarity appears. On busy days, it vanishes. Another important effect of rhythm is how it supports memory consolidation. The brain organizes memories more efficiently when experiences occur within predictable patterns. Repetition anchors memory. Events find their place within a familiar sequence. This reduces confusion and mental effort. When days follow no clear pattern, memories blur together. The brain must work harder to separate and retrieve them. Over time, this extra work contributes to mental fatigue. People who age well mentally often have days that resemble one another enough to give memory a stable framework. Their experiences feel ordered, even when life is full. Rhythm also influences emotional regulation. Predictable routines reduce emotional volatility. The brain knows when rest is coming, when interaction will occur, and when demands will ease. This knowledge calms emotional responses. Over time, emotions settle into a narrower range. Thought becomes clearer because it is not constantly interrupted by emotional spikes. In irregular lives, emotional states shift more frequently. The brain must adjust repeatedly. This adjustment is costly. Over decades, it weakens mental resilience. People may feel mentally tired without understanding why. The rhythm of engagement and withdrawal is another key element. Brains that remain clear tend to have a natural alternation between being engaged and being disengaged. They interact, then retreat. This alternation mirrors biological rhythms that support recovery. When engagement is continuous, recovery is incomplete. Over time, incomplete recovery accumulates as mental strain. Many people who fade earlier live lives where disengagement feels unproductive or unnecessary. The brain rarely rests while awake. This makes later life clarity harder to maintain. Importantly, rhythm also shapes how the brain relates to the future. In rhythmic lives, the future feels predictable. This reduces anxiety. In chaotic lives, the future feels uncertain. Anxiety increases. Over decades, this difference affects mental aging. Brains that learn to expect continuity remain calm. Brains that learn to expect disruption remain alert. Calm supports clarity. Constant alertness erodes it. Rhythm does not require a simple or boring life. It requires consistency and structure. A life can be rich and still rhythmic. What matters is that the brain recognizes a pattern it can rely on. When such a pattern exists, mental systems align naturally. Attention stabilizes. Memory integrates. Emotions regulate. Thought flows. Without rhythm, the brain is forced to improvise constantly. Improvisation is costly over time. Mental sharpness then feels fragile. Understanding this helps explain why some people become clearer as they age. Their lives have gradually settled into rhythms that match the brain's changing needs. Those who fade earlier often continue to live within patterns that demand constant adjustment. The difference is not willpower or intelligence. It is alignment between daily rhythm and biological capacity built slowly over many years. As rhythm becomes established across years, one final distinction emerges between lives that support lasting mental clarity and those that quietly erode it: the ability to slow without losing direction. Slowing is often misunderstood as withdrawal or decline, but for the aging brain, slowing is a form of alignment. When pace decreases while structure remains, the brain experiences continuity rather than loss. Thought has time to unfold. Memory connects more easily. Attention no longer needs to jump ahead. People who remain mentally clear later in life often slow their pace without dismantling their routines. Their days still have shape. Activities still occur in a recognizable order. This combination allows the brain to relax into its rhythm while preserving a sense of purpose. In contrast, when slowing is forced without structure, the brain experiences drift. Time loses definition. Days blur together. Without anchors, attention wanders and clarity weakens. This is often mistaken for fading, but it is frequently a problem of rhythm rather than capacity. Another important element is how rhythm supports anticipation without pressure. In rhythmic lives, the brain anticipates gently. It knows what is coming without needing to prepare aggressively. This soft anticipation allows cognitive systems to warm up gradually. Tasks feel manageable. In irregular lives, anticipation becomes sharp. The brain braces itself. This bracing consumes energy. Over decades, sharp anticipation hardens into constant readiness. Mental clarity suffers because the brain is rarely fully present. People who age well mentally often cultivate days that allow anticipation to be mild rather than urgent. They do not rush transitions. They move from one activity to another with familiarity. This protects clarity by reducing internal friction. Rhythm also influences how the brain experiences completion. When activities begin and end in predictable ways, the brain registers closure. Closure allows cognitive systems to release effort. Without closure, effort lingers. Thoughts remain partially active. Over time, this lingering creates mental clutter. People who remain clear often finish things. Not necessarily tasks, but phases of the day. Meals end. Conversations settle. Rest has a beginning and an end. These markers signal the brain to reset. In chaotic rhythms, activities overlap endlessly. The brain carries unfinished loops. Mental sharpness then feels fragile because attention is never fully freed. Another subtle role of rhythm is how it supports self-trust. When days unfold reliably, the brain learns that it can rely on its environment. This reduces internal checking. Thought flows more smoothly because it is not constantly verifying what comes next. Over time, this trust becomes internalized. The brain feels less need to monitor itself. This quiet confidence supports clarity. In unpredictable rhythms, trust remains external and fragile. The brain must stay alert. Self-monitoring increases. Thought becomes cautious. Over decades, this vigilance erodes ease. Importantly, rhythm also protects the brain from regret. When life has rhythm, time feels inhabited. Days feel used rather than lost. This reduces backward pull. The brain spends less energy replaying or questioning. Thought stays oriented toward the present. In lives without rhythm, time can feel empty or rushed. The mind oscillates between past and future. Clarity weakens as attention is pulled away from now. People who remain sharp often describe a sense of being where they are. This presence is supported by rhythm. Finally, rhythm allows the brain to age without panic. Changes are absorbed gradually. Slowing feels natural rather than alarming. The brain recognizes itself across time. This continuity is essential. When rhythm is absent, change feels abrupt. The brain experiences each shift as loss. Mental sharpness then feels unstable. By understanding rhythm as a foundation rather than a constraint, we see why some people remain clear into old age. Their lives offer a dependable structure that allows slowing without disorientation. Their brains are not fighting time, they are moving with it. This movement preserves clarity not through effort, but through steady alignment repeated quietly across years. One of the final elements that shapes why some people remain mentally sharp into later life while others fade earlier is how meaning is maintained when productivity declines. For much of adulthood, meaning is often tied to output, usefulness, and visible contribution. The brain becomes accustomed to measuring itself through results. As age advances and external roles change, this framework weakens. When meaning collapses with productivity, the brain loses a stabilizing reference point. Thought becomes restless, searching for justification. Mental clarity suffers not because ability disappears, but because orientation is lost. In contrast, people who remain clear often undergo a gradual shift in how meaning is experienced. Meaning moves away from doing and toward being. It becomes rooted in presence, continuity, and understanding rather than achievement. This shift reduces internal pressure. The brain no longer needs to prove its value through constant activity. It can settle into observation, reflection. Another important aspect is how the brain relates to usefulness. In later life, usefulness often becomes less visible but not less real. Listening, remembering, stabilizing relationships, and holding perspective are subtle contributions. Brains that recognize these roles remain oriented. Brains that equate usefulness only with productivity experience dislocation. This dislocation creates cognitive strain. The mind feels adrift. Over time, this strain can resemble fading, yet the underlying issue is not cognitive decline, it is loss of meaning structure. People who remain sharp often retain a sense of place even when their roles change. Their brains continue to feel anchored. This anchoring protects clarity. Purpose also influences how the brain engages with time. When purpose remains, time feels inhabited. Days have weight, moments connect. When purpose disappears, time stretches or collapses. The brain struggles to organize experience. Memory becomes less coherent because events lack significance. Thought wanders, mental sharpness weakens. This is not inevitable. It reflects whether meaning was allowed to evolve rather than disappear. Another subtle factor is how curiosity changes with age. Curiosity in later life often becomes quieter. It is less about novelty and more about depth. People who remain clear allow this change. They remain curious in a narrower but richer way. Their curiosity aligns with what they already know. This alignment reduces effort. The brain explores without strain. Those who believe curiosity must always look youthful may feel frustrated. They chase stimulation that no longer fits. Over time, this mismatch erodes clarity. Meaning also interacts with emotional closure. When life experiences have found some resolution, the brain carries less unfinished business. Thought becomes lighter. Reflection becomes possible. When meaning remains unresolved, the brain stays engaged in silent argument. This consumes resources. People who remain sharp often have made peace with much of their past. This peace does not require happiness. It requires acceptance. Acceptance quiets the mind. Quiet supports clarity. Importantly, meaning in later life does not need to be grand. It needs to be stable. Simple rituals, familiar values, and a sense of continuity are enough. The brain responds to stability. It relaxes when it knows why it exists in its current form. When meaning is absent or questioned constantly, the brain stays alert. Alertness over time drains clarity. Finally, meaning allows the brain to age without fear. When life feels coherent, changes feel integrated. When life feels fragmented, changes feel threatening. People who remain sharp often describe feeling whole even as abilities shift. Their brains recognize themselves across time. This recognition stabilizes thought. Mental sharpness then persists, not because the brain resists aging, but because it knows where it stands within it. Meaning, in this sense, is not philosophical decoration. It is a structural support. It gives the aging brain a place to rest. When that place exists, clarity can remain long after speed and novelty have faded. As meaning continues to shift in later life, another quiet force emerges that strongly influences mental clarity. The sense of continuity between who a person has been and who they are becoming. The brain relies on continuity to stay oriented. When life feels like a connected story rather than a series of broken chapters, thought remains grounded. People who remain mentally sharp often experience their later years not as a rupture, but as an extension. Their abilities change, but their inner narrative continues. This continuity reduces cognitive strain. The brain does not need to constantly reinterpret itself. It knows where it came from and where it stands. In contrast, when aging is experienced as a sharp break, the brain loses its reference frame. Thought becomes unsettled. Searching for a stable identity, mental clarity weakens not because the brain cannot think, but because it no longer knows how to place itself in time. Another important aspect of meaning is contribution without urgency. In later life, contribution often becomes slower and less visible. It may take the form of presence rather than action. They search for relevance through effort rather than connection. Over time, this effort exhausts mental systems. People who remain sharp often feel useful without needing to prove it. Their sense of contribution is internal rather than measured. This internal grounding protects clarity. Meaning also shapes how the brain processes loss. Loss is unavoidable across a long life. Roles end. People leave. Capacities change. When meaning is flexible, loss can be integrated. The brain adjusts its narrative. Thought remains coherent. When meaning is rigid, loss creates fracture. The brain revisits what is gone repeatedly, unable to reposition itself. This repetitive processing consumes attention. Over decades, it contributes to mental fatigue. Those who remain clear often allow meaning to reconfigure after loss. They do not deny change, but they do not let it erase coherence. This adaptability supports clarity. Another subtle contributor is how meaning influences emotional tone. Meaning provides a background sense of order. When this order exists, emotions settle more easily. Thought becomes less reactive. The brain is not constantly pulled into evaluation. When meaning is absent or unstable, emotions fluctuate more. The brain must manage these fluctuations. This management drains resources. Mental sharpness then becomes harder to sustain. People who remain clear often describe a sense of calm that is not tied to happiness, but to acceptance. Acceptance reduces internal friction. Friction weakens clarity. Meaning also interacts with time perspective. When life feels meaningful, time feels inhabited. Moments feel placed within a larger whole. This supports memory and attention. When meaning fades, time feels empty or rushed. The brain struggles to organize experience. Thought loses depth. Mental sharpness suffers because there is no framework to hold it. Importantly, meaning does not need to be consciously articulated. It can be lived rather than named. Simple routines, values held quietly, and a sense of belonging are enough. The brain responds to these signals. It relaxes when it senses coherence. Finally, meaning protects the brain from fear of irrelevance. When a person feels that their existence still fits within a larger pattern, aging feels less threatening. The brain does not brace itself against time. It moves with it. This movement preserves clarity. Those who fade earlier often experience aging as displacement. The brain remains on guard. Guarded thinking is costly. Clear thinking requires safety. Meaning provides that safety. By understanding meaning as a cognitive support rather than an abstract idea, we can see why some people remain mentally sharp long after visible roles have changed. Their brains are not clinging to the past. They are anchored in a sense of continuity that allows thought to remain steady. Mental clarity, in this light, is not only about how the brain works, but about whether it knows why it is still here and how it belongs within the life it has lived. As meaning settles into a quieter and more stable form, the final distinction between lasting mental clarity and early fading becomes clear in how a person relates to their own presence. Presence is not alertness or effort. It is the feeling of being fully where one is, without the need to justify it. The aging brain responds strongly to this state. When presence is allowed, mental systems relax. Thought no longer rushes to evaluate itself. Memory surfaces when needed rather than being forced. Attention stays with what is in front of it instead of drifting toward what is missing or expected. People who remain mentally sharp later in life often live with a strong sense of presence. Their minds are not constantly negotiating their worth. They are simply engaged with the moment as it unfolds. In contrast, when presence is lost, the brain stays divided. One part observes while another judges. Over time, clarity weakens under the weight of constant self-reference. Another important element is how presence allows the brain to integrate all the changes discussed throughout this video. Slowing, adaptation, rhythm, memory, stress, and meaning all converge in presence. When presence exists, these elements align. The brain is no longer pulled in opposing directions. It does not fight its pace. It does not rush its memory. It does not demand constant output. This alignment produces a form of clarity that is not loud or fast, but steady and reliable. People who fade earlier often lack this alignment. Their brains are still capable, but they are split between who they think they should be and who they are becoming. This split creates tension. Tension drains clarity. Presence resolves this split by allowing the brain to inhabit its current form without resistance. Presence also changes how time is experienced. When a person is present, time feels continuous. Moments connect naturally. Memory and anticipation soften. The brain is not pulled excessively into the past or the future. This continuity supports calm thinking. When presence is absent, time fractures. The mind oscillates between regret and worry. Thought becomes scattered. Mental sharpness suffers not because thinking stops, but because it cannot settle. People who remain clear often experience time as something they are inside, rather than something chasing them. This experience protects clarity. Importantly, presence is not achieved through effort. Effort pushes the brain back into performance. Presence arises when effort relaxes. This relaxation becomes more accessible later in life if it is allowed. Those who try to force sharpness often lose presence. Those who allow presence often find clarity. This is why many individuals appear mentally clear even when their abilities have changed. Their minds are no longer busy defending themselves. They are available. Finally, presence provides closure, not an ending, but a sense of completeness. When life feels complete enough, the brain stops searching for resolution. Thought becomes spacious. This spaciousness allows clarity to remain even as speed, memory, precision, and energy shift. In this way, the deepest reason some people stay sharp at 80 while others fade earlier is not found in any single factor. It is found in the accumulation of alignment between pace and rhythm, between memory and expectation, between effort and recovery, between meaning and presence. When this alignment exists, the brain ages without panic. It continues to function not by resisting change, but by settling into it. Mental sharpness, then, is not a race against time. It is the quiet result of allowing the mind to arrive fully where it already is.